It is sometimes surprising that for which a person will or won't stand, and the rights for which someone is willing to risk all. In 1907, class friction in Paris was coming to a boil, and in defiance of strict rules placed upon them by their employers and high-class Parisians, men across Paris were walking off the job, determined to no longer be humiliated. A great strike had begun, and the working class men who embodied it were determined not to go back to work until they got what they demanded: mustaches. Feeling humiliated and emasculated, Parisian waiters had decided that their mustaches and their dignity was more important than a paycheck. The Great Paris Moustache Strike of 1907 is history that deserves to be remembered. Understanding the mustache strike means understanding what made a mustache so important in the first place. Mustaches had since antiquity been used by cultures in Europe and globally to denote status, rank, profession, and more. Roman historian Tacitus in the 1st century describes several Germanic tribal customs, including young men only shaving once they'd proven themselves in battle. The Romans particularly took issue with the barbarian custom of wearing a mustache without a beard. More recently in Europe, a particular unit of soldier had popularized mustaches. Hussars were a kind of light cavalry that were first organized in Hungary at the end of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, with units made primarily of ethnic Serbs. Hungarian light hussars were used for reconnaissance and foraging duties, ranging around the army to secure supplies and fight skirmishes with the enemy. Units of hussars were raised across the continent, and hussar units were widely used in European wars after the 15th century. The unit played a prominent role in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars on all sides of the conflict. Hussars earned an impressive reputation for daring, recklessness, adventuring, and hard drinking. They became the swashbuckling heroes of the age. General Antoine Charles Louis, the Count of LaSalle, embodied the stereotype and was called the Hussar General. He once said, "Any hussar who is not dead by the age of 30 is a blackguard." He died in combat at 34. The uniform that came to define a hussar began with Hungarian fashion, and by the end of the 18th century, hussars all wore the Hungarian Attila jacket, a short coat with horizontal gold braid, high boots, and a tall hat. This uniform spread throughout hussar units. In 1806, when England first created hussar units, they adopted the style and dress of their counterparts on the continent. Included as part of the uniform was the moustache. Both the uniforms and the moustaches were worn to give the soldiers a fierce appearance. This was still the ostensible reason for soldiers wearing it during the Napoleonic Wars. The moustache quickly caught on. British cavalry units began imitating the hussar units. One English general complained that the practice of wearing mustachios is now growing very general throughout the service, and that it is un-English and a hindrance to recruiting. In 1830, Commander-in-Chief Lord Hill denied the Royal North British Dragoons their request to grow moustaches, as the dragoons can derive no additional weight from the wearing of mustachios. It became almost standard in the French army, and elite grenadier units had to wear large mustaches. By the 1840s, wearing mustachios was generally allowed, and by the 1860s, they become mandatory. Simultaneously, civilians were generally rejecting mustaches and facial hair, and men's fashion was instead driving towards black suits and clean-shaven faces. This twin cultural movement, especially in France, made wearing mustache a symbol of manliness, bravery, and especially military service. Those who could not grow mustaches were obliged to fake it, buying false mustaches to hide their hairless upper lips. The wearing of mustaches simultaneously was taken up by the aristocracy. Most French soldiers after the mid-18th century had to wear mustaches, although some low-rank soldiers were specifically forbidden from wearing them. By the end of the century, mustaches in French became an important symbol of the well-to-do, civilian or military, and a man could hardly be without one. Paris in the mid-18th century introduced something we now think of as ubiquitous: the restaurant. The first use of the word restaurant to refer to a public venue where one could order food dates to 1765, when a French chef opened a business in Paris selling soups and other restaurants, in this case meaning something like restoratives. The first real restaurant is considered to be the Paris Le Grand Taverne de Londres in 1780s, because it was the first to combine the four essentials of elegant room: smart waiters, a choice cellar, and superior cooking. The first restaurants were very studiously offering to diners an elegant experience meant to imitate dining in an upscale home, complete with servants. With that came a simple rule: waiters weren't allowed to wear mustaches, as the servants that they were imitating also would not have been allowed to wear mustaches. This was an essential part of the dining experience, and one French historian described it as paying to humiliate people in an almost institutional way. Those eating at restaurants in the 19th century paid for an experience, and the experience was to be the master. As the modern era and the Industrial Revolution fostered a growing middle class, aristocrats had to find new ways to protect status. Protecting their status symbols was a driving force behind sumptuary laws, which banned certain classes of people from wearing particular clothes or valuable jewelry the world over. In France, the moustache had become part of the cultural combat, with up-and-coming middle-class men proudly wearing the moustache to note themselves part of the upper class. To be denied the moustache was not a trifling matter. An 1883 French short story called The Moustache, written by Guy de Maupassant, focuses on a woman mourning her husband's moustache, which he shaved off in order to take on a female role in a play. "A man without a moustache is no longer a man," she says, "and he lacks the insignia of our national character." Frenchmen, and especially French veterans, felt the moustache bans keenly. When a veteran was forced to shave off his moustache for a job, it wasn't just a fashion choice, but one that deprived him of a well-known symbol of his service. This is what led, sometime in the spring of 1907, to the walkout of waiters all over Paris in the Great Moustache Strike. The strike itself was, of course, about more than just moustaches. Tied into the Industrial Revolution, labor and unions were fighting tooth and nail for all kinds of things: better hours, breaks, and better pay. The New York Times says that waiters work harder under unfair conditions, and they receive no wages, and that employers took a percentage of their tips. It was, however, the moustache that became the greatest symbol for the strike. There was a waiters' union at the time, but it's unclear exactly when or how many participated in the strike, and likely the participants and the size of the strike waxed and waned. Possibly this is because owners negotiated directly with their own employees to keep their businesses open. Contemporary reports estimate that from the hundreds to the thousands were involved, and it cost restaurants 25,000 francs every day. The New York Times first reported on the strike on April 18th, writing that sealed instructions to stop work were sent out on the 17th, and that by 6 p.m. a number of men had walked off the job. Most of the cafes were able to keep open, but by lunch the following day the strike had spread, causing the greatest inconvenience, and those who started had to be protected by police from the strikers. The Los Angeles Times proclaimed on April 20th, "The right to wear mustaches at all cost is the cry of several thousand waiters who went on strike today." The paper reported that strikers went to restaurants that were still open and tried to convince the waiters to join the strike. They were so successful, the paper noted, that police expelled every smooth-shaven man, including a dozen innocent Americans who had just arrived in town, ignorant of the strike, and who were bewildered by their hostile reception. The Confederation of Labor stood by the strike and decried the government's attempts to defeat the efforts of the working men to ameliorate their condition. French opinion was divided, if bemused. One French newspaper mocked that the waiters would just strike again when moustaches went out of style. Another newspaper published a poem warning that waiters would be able to hide easily their profession after hours. Oh, the horror! The poem also warned that pay for the waiters could only increase the price of beer, and that the waiters would be laughing from beneath their mustaches at the poor people who had to pay. From a different angle, Le Journal complained mustaches were unhygienic. "Will they claim their mustache?" the writer asked. "From their nostrils to our drinks, bacteria and illness would invade the diner's stomach, kidneys, and our most delicate organs. Besides," the writer went on, "it is repugnant to watch a mustached man eat." The writer was apparently ignoring the fact that mustachioed diners were already eating at restaurants. But defenders argued just as passionately for the waiter's rights to grow a mustache. A letter in the newspaper L'Avenir de Haute-Pyrénées argued that the mustaches are ridiculous, and yet waiters should have the right to wear them. "These gentlemen will wear the mustache. I congratulate them." A letter published in the French newspaper La Presse argued that mustaches might be just vanity, but waiters not given up on the vanities of the world, and this one can pass as one of the most innocent. The writer went on to opine that waiters should finally be able to show that they are men, free men, that they have no more kings, no more masters, and can wear at their leisure the symbol of the all-powerful male, the moustache. Antide Boyer, a socialist legislator from Marseille, had introduced a bill in Parliament even before the strike, had begun to make it illegal for an employer to forbid an employee from wearing a moustache, and fine and even imprison employers who broke the law. Nowadays, some misguided noblemen and presumptuous middle-class folk cling to the belief that they are honoring themselves by forbidding their servants, whom they treat as slaves, to wear moustaches. Boyer called the practice grotesque and humiliating and contrary to the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Strikes of numerous groups seem to have gone across the country, with cooks, bakers, and others joining with the waiters to protest, although perhaps not all of them were as concerned with moustaches. Still, ultimately, the strike seems to have fallen apart, with the New York Times reported that the strike ended in the first week of May. The bill in Parliament failed as well, but even if the waiters won little else, they did win from employers the right to grow moustaches. Labor groups were disappointed that the strikers didn't maintain their discipline and gave up the strike for a symbolic victory that offered little in the way of material gain while making no gains on more substantive complaints. Soon, Paris restaurants were full of men growing moustaches, providing opportunities of studying various stages of the human countenance, from clean-shaven to bearded. When one employer attempted to reinstate the rule to shave, his workers instantly went on strike again. One article written after the fact complained that in place of the shaved mustache, now waiters were forced to wear uniforms, calling the victory barren, if not Pyrrhic. But it's possible that that writer really did not understand the importance of a mustache to a Frenchman in 1907. Mustaches were important enough that 15 years later, Ernest Hemingway could lament in his memoirs a waiter who was forced to shave off his dragoon's mustache. A mustache was more than a fashion statement. It was more than a whim. It was a matter of pride. And that victory might have been symbolic, but to those waiters in Parisian cafes, their mustache was a symbol that they were free men. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.